Hey everybody, so I kind of stumbled onto instance variables and not, so there's a couple different ways I guess of looking at instance variables for objects and just in Python. I think this applies to other object-oriented programming languages, but the topic I want to cover is just using dynamic instance variables to dynamically update instances of an object. In this case, we'll look at doing that for a point and adding some type of variable to that object. And I could see this kind of being something that would be handy in situations where you're looping through a lot of objects. Say it's HVAC related, so you're looping through duct elements. You're doing something to them to pull out certain information or try to think of it in certain ways. Maybe it's routing the duct, and so you want to associate some sort of parameter to that element, but you don't want to embed it in the object itself, because there are, in Revit objects, they have a property where you can embed extra things into it if you need to. So say this is something only for the Dynamo or the Dynamo script, and you want to pass the information throughout the script and keep it organized. This would be one way to go about it. And I've done this in the past by extending existing classes to include extra properties, and that's what this wrapper class over here example is, and I'll show you that in a second. There's 3 examples here, and so we'll look at starting with the first one. I'll just show you an object with instance properties and then show you what I mean by dynamically adding new properties to an object. Interestingly, I just didn't know about this, and I guess because of the way Python's built and the way that when it executes, it runs the code, you can dynamically update elements with properties, or like in this case, instance variables. So I never knew that before, and I could see that being helpful in Dynamo because you're not doing anything to the class, so you're not destroying the structure of the element or doing anything like that. There are some things to think about, and I'll cover those in a minute. But yeah, so I want to show you some examples of a class, and this would be similar to how, say, an object is created in Dynamo or Revit. So I'm gonna get rid of all of this, and actually I don't need anything in this node. By the way, this will be in the in my GitHub, so if you want to check that out and download this stuff, you can do that. So this init function at the start of the class will kind of kick off whenever you create a new instance, and it creates those variables. And so this would be kind of like a typical, say, the point class. And I won't do a good job of describing everything about a class, and that's not necessarily what I'm trying to do here. And so I'd recommend checking out, say, a course on LinkedIn Learning. There's a really good one that covers classes. There's also a good one on Coursera as well. These are Python classes. I can't remember their names, but I definitely recommend checking those out if you want to learn from experts in Python. And so this would be kind of like a class here, and there may be other functions. Say, I'm trying to think of some of the other functions related to related to points. I can't remember, but let's just say get coordinates. And so we'll pass self into that. And so we might do, so this might return, and this is just an example of a class, say the point class, and how instance variables would be managed. So these are instance variables. I'm just adding a function just so you guys kind of get a better idea. So return okay, so there's our class, and then if we wanted to, we could output this. So let's do one. So there's our point object. You can see that there. If we wanted to get the x variable, then we could just do x. Run that. You can see we've got 1, which makes sense. If we do y, we should have 2. And then we could run our function dot get coordinates. And then we've got 1 and 2. So that would be kind of like what you would do, say, if you wanted to add more properties to this. You could come up here and add another self dot whatever. But those classes, those objects are in Revit or they're in Dynamo, and I don't want to necessarily mess with the structure of the element itself. And so you could extend it by using like super classes and all that stuff, which I'm not going to show any of that. I wouldn't do a good job anyways, but that's one way you could like pull from the super class into your subclass and create a new class of points with extra properties. But that's where I think this is really handy, is doing the dynamic, like adding instance variables dynamically. So you could do something like, here's your point. Let me pull that back. So we could do point 1 equals that, and then we can copy this down here and then make that point 2. And then let's just change this so that's very clear on what's what. And then what we can do is go for, we can loop through that. So I'm just going to create a list. L equals. So you could imagine this as a input. Of points. So these could be, actual Dynamo points. And then what we can do is say for I and L, we can say I dot, and we can just make this up. We can say I dot chord equals, maybe it's a tuple, and we're just going to put 0. And then we'll append that, or actually we'll just do out equals L. So there's our point objects. Now what we can do is let's just index into it, get the first one, and then we can do dot chord, and then we can see it's 0, 0, 0, because it's whenever you execute the code, it is dynamic, like it is adding the instance variable dynamically to the object whenever it's executing. So that allows you to add variables to it. And so I'm going to save that. I'm going to move over here, and then we're going to do the same thing, but with an actual Python or an actual Dynamo object. So you can think of this as like a Revit object as well, like the duct example. So here we've got two inputs. We've got 2 points. So these are instances of the point object. And then we've got 2 strings for color. And then we're going to add a color property to these instances. And so just like before, how I was looping through the list and adding them to it, that's what I'm doing here as well. So I'm zipping the 2 lists together, elements and colors. I'm going for element color in elements and colors, and then element dot color equals color, and then that's what that's doing is it's creating that new property, that variable, and associating it to the instance, and then we are adding that to the out list, which we've defined up here. And then what we're returning is the color itself. So I'm going to get rid of that so you can see that it's the element. So we can see it's the point object, and then I'm going to return color. So I can think of a lot of ways to use that. There was a duct tool I was working on where I was looping through elements and I had all these lists I was managing, and I use dictionaries a lot, but this I was thinking I could use in different scenarios where I'm looping through items and I'm trying to track different information on those items. I could add the data directly to the object, maybe simplifying some of the lists that I'm dealing with. And so at some point in the future when I do use this method, I'll certainly share it on my channel. But in the meantime, I've just got these examples. And so the last one here is a wrapper class. I have used this in the past. I didn't know you could add instance variables dynamically to instances. And so what I would do is I would extend the class by doing it this way. And so I would, like in this case, we've got our class called colored inputs, and then we've got the init function defining the variables, and so we've got our point information being pulled from the point object, and so and then we've got the color being defined. So that's an instance variable we're adding, and so it's taking like the existing functionality and then we're wrapping our own extra functionality to this item. And so down here I just got a couple methods built in this class that return the coordinates, and so that's what you see here, an index 0 and 2, and then for this other one I've got the coordinates plus the color there. So at the end you can see red, and at the end here you can see blue. And so here we are calling that, or creating that object, that instance, and then down here I'm just returning everything and I'm calling their different methods. So this is a wrapper class, and I stumbled on that a long time ago, Googling some stuff. Again, I was trying to find ways to manage data. I've messed around with in Revit, and I cannot remember it, but I think it's something pretty cool if you guys haven't dealt with this. So, extensible storage is what I'm looking for. Let's try to search for it. I'm going to go into a 3D view. All right, so I'm not going to dig into this, but extensible storage, it's been a while, and I think I have something on my GitHub where I added information to an element, but what I did was, because in this particular example, the person would have to run the script, so it's a Dynamo script, it would add data to the element. Some add-ins use extensible storage to add in certain information. It's something to be cautious about because you don't want to add a ton of extra data and bog down somebody's model. And so in this Dynamo script, they would run it, it add data to the element, and then they would run it a second time, and it would use the old data that it captured on the first run, and then use it to run some functions, and then it would purge out that information from the model. They would only really need to run it 2 times on a project, and so it was a fun exercise just to see if I could do that. But that's another thing you could do when it comes to adding things to objects. In that case, because they could run the Dynamo script at a later point, that might be a better option instead of trying to write to objects in Revit. Because I'm not sure how instance variables operate after the fact, if that stuff's cleaned out after you close Dynamo. So it's something to consider, is how are they using this tool? You know, how do you need to save those items? So, and actually, let me Google it real quick, and I'll show you guys what I'm talking about with extensible storage. This is Revit 24. I really don't know where that would be. Maybe that's this. I have no idea, but I'm gonna Google and then I'll show you guys that. So, okay, so I found a couple things that's kind of interesting, and so I'm going to show you guys. So this is extensible storage if you want to learn more about it. Essentially, if you need to write information to Revit elements and that information needs to be stored in those elements even after a model is closed, then that might be a good method. And then it looks like at some point, for some reason, extensible storage was removed from the sample model, which the model I'm in right now is a sample model from Autodesk for 2024. So there's other sample models as well. So I don't know if this means for all of them or what that means. And it looks like for the multidiscipline template files as well. So there might be other information there, but anyways, if you get into any issues in 24, I would say just kind of do some research on that and see how to store information. That may have changed in the later versions. So one last thing I wanted to talk about when it comes to adding instance variables dynamically to instances is that you have to be considerate of, you have to be cautious a little bit. It depends on the complexity and what your application's doing. I think for Dynamo Python uses, it's really not that big of a deal. But even then, you just need to be organized in how you name things and manage this stuff. And then also adding good documentation is always helpful, and I would always recommend that if you're working in a large firm, even if you're not, if somebody gets a hold of your stuff at some point at your firm at a later point, maybe you move on and somebody else is there, it's always helpful. So good documentation in your stuff is good. Grouping, adding notes, all that stuff. But some things to consider if you use this method of adding things to elements is to consider the readability of the code itself. Make sure that it isn't difficult to understand, because like the point, say you add another point like an X property to it, like an underscore X or some weird property, and now it's kind of confusing on what exactly is happening there. What is this X variable supposed to mean? How am I supposed to use this? Also, errors. So make sure that you know what variables you're adding, how to use them, what you're doing with them. If people try to leverage them in your code, they're adding to your Dynamo script. You're adding stuff, and you use the wrong variables. You could easily see where that could get messy, because you don't have things documented. If you've got a lot of code, it could get messy. You don't remember what variables you have, and so that could create errors. And then also inconsistencies. So if you go and create a .x variable, and you add at some point in the code a method adds something to it, a number, string, whatever, and then later on maybe you have another method for a different condition, and you name that property something else on accident, you could see where that could get messy. So a couple things to consider. I think for the most part, like, this isn't a thing you would do for if you're writing an actual application. You would add those instance properties to the class itself, like you saw over here. You'd add them in the init method. Though in these instances where you're using a third party, you're using an application, almost within an application. You have these Python scripts that are reading these Dynamo objects or Revit objects that you're then adding properties to. I don't think it's a big deal. I think it's a bigger deal when it's a huge thing of code. You just got to consider that stuff. So anyways, that's really all I've got. I wanted to talk about this, show some examples. I think it's kind of cool. I really like it. I feel like I'm going to use this at some point. I just don't have any use right now. But I deal with a lot of data in some of my scripts, and so I may rethink how I'm going to manage that stuff. And so if I create an actual practical script using this method, then I'll share that with you guys. It'll be on my GitHub with everything else. So that's all I've got. By the way, check out the Discord. The links below. Really awesome community. A lot of cool conversations in there, so check that out if you want. Also, that's it. I'll share those two links that I showed you guys. Those will be below as well, so check those out. But anyways, thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you in the next one.